Okay, welcome to part 2 of creating a very basic functional resume. For part 2, I added a table of contents on the left-hand side that allows me to toggle on and off the relevant projects or experiences I'd like to include in my resume, which could vary from one job application to another. From here, I could take it a step further and have different written iterations of each project and experience, but I think this is sufficient for now. Anyhow, let's get started and build it then, shall we? Yay. Let's first look back at the index.html we had previously written. If you notice, I'm using the version with the semantic syntax, but the one without would also work just fine. You'd simply have to make changes accordingly. This is what the index.html looks like after rendering it. As mentioned in the previous video, the resume can be broken up into sections. These sections follow a similar pattern, which in turn can be useful for importing cleanly using JavaScript. As such, we'll remove them from our index.html and replace them with the appropriate placeholders for now. Here's the first one, the second one, and the third one. All three of these sections were encapsulated by one main tag and should look something like this when removed. We'll fill this main tag with the appropriate placeholders mentioned moments ago. Additionally, we'll add a button, Populate Resume button, which is a temporary measure we'll be using to populate the resume manually until we make this automatic. The index.html should be structured something like this, with the ellipsis representing the rest of the HTML code. The rendering should then look like this, only leaving behind the main header in the skills section, which has a different structure than the other sections, so we won't be populating it using JavaScript. It also doesn't really ever change from resume to resume, so I think it's fine as is. Now, let's go back to our style.css from the last video. In particular, let's focus on the following stylings. We'll be deleting these now because we got rid of the dark mode toggle button. Additionally, we'll be styling the Populate Resume button. I kept it simple with minimal styling. I kind of just wanted to move it out of the way since we'll be deleting this soon anyway. Earlier, I mentioned that we would be populating this resume using JavaScript, but I hadn't mentioned that we'd still need a source for the resume content. Our source will be a JSON file named data.json, populated with nested key value pairs, structured as follows. We'll have a key representing the title, followed by a list of values representing the properties, all nested within a section, which will be repeated for each section as shown here. Now that we've populated our JSON file, let's draw our attention to the JavaScript. We'll first be deleting this dark mode toggle button functionality, since we no longer need it. We'll then be focusing on the Populate Resume button and data.json in the script.js file. This button will need to run asynchronously, or in other words, on a separate thread, because we need to retrieve the data from the JSON file, which takes time, not much, but it is an instant. Additionally, we'll want to create a simple index that keeps track of what is toggled on or off by default. From here, we'll finally be adding functionality to the Populate Resume button, which will call a fetch data method and use that data to populate the resume using the Populate Resume method, which from right to left takes in the DOM ID of the location we'll be populating, the actual section data, which in this case is projects, and the display true/false values of that section data, which is found in entry indexes. So let's start writing them, shall we? As mentioned previously, we want to fetch the data asynchronously because it takes time to get this data, and we don't know how long, so we will simply wait on a separate thread until we receive a response, and merge back into the main thread once we have received it. From there on, we'll populate the resume by first fetching the section through its location in the DOM using its identifier, and we'll populate its inner HTML. I don't want to focus too much on this line-by-line code, but basically the location currently uses all lowercase and dashes for the key. I simply restyled it using JavaScript to be more pleasing to the eye in the HTML rendering. From there, I looped through each entry in entry index and added it to the inner HTML of that section. The createElementEntry method in particular does a lot of the key structuring for each property in the entry, as follows. Basically, we have the template and are filling in that template with the key value pairs from the JSON file. You may have noticed that right now we were only handling the project section. This was intentional. I usually like to focus on a small part first before expanding outward. More so because the other sections follow the same process and are simply just copy and paste. Also, remember how earlier I had a really ugly line where I was splitting the location ID, mapping it to uppercase, slicing, joining, and all that? Well, I later created this ID aliases variable, which helps address that horrible line of code. That being said, we won't replace that line of code just yet, because I want to focus on the other parts of the code first. If you recall, we were previously using the populateResume method to only populate the projects. Let's now add the other sections. Bam. Also, I want to change the fact that I was previously using dot notation to specify the keys, but now I'll be using bracket notation. This is because it's much more forgiving with special characters such as a dash, or with spaces and so on. Let's now look back at the index.html. Now that we know that everything is functioning properly, we can get rid of the populateResume button. I prefer using buttons first because they're easier to deal with when debugging, since it gives me full control of when they execute and when they don't. But we'll now be replacing it with an onload method. For now, we'll get rid of this button and replace it with a placeholder for the resume options table of contents. Additionally, we'll style it so it's located on the top left corner. And we'll make it so it doesn't display on export or print. And we'll also unset the absolute styling on small screens and simply let it flow normally. Going back to the JavaScript, we'll no longer fetch the populateResume button, since it no longer exists. And we'll replace the populateResume click event with a document event listener that runs on page, or in other words, DOM load. From here, we can get rid of that ugly line of code I mentioned earlier and replace it with the following. It looks much cleaner, right? It's also easier to maintain since I don't have to worry about the names being structured in a certain format. I now want to give a brief outline of everything we've written, starting out with the key parts to populateResume, which consists of the entry indexes variable, as well as the ID aliases variable used to better format the section headers, and the location ID, which is used to fetch the DOM element. From there, we have the createElementEntry method, which is the core to structuring the innards of a section, and the event listener that runs everything from fetching data to populating it on a document load. And that's everything for loading the data. We now want to be able to toggle it from the user interface. To cleanly handle this, I've encapsulated all the current code into an updateResume method, which can be useful whenever it needs to be refreshed, which as of right now is just on document load, but will soon change. That's because we want to create a render checkboxes method that will allow us to change what's currently being rendered and what's not from the front end. Each checkbox is tied to an entry in entry indexes and includes an onChange handler that updates the data and calls updateResume. Once all categories and items are processed, the complete HTML string is injected into the resume options element, so the checkboxes appear on the page. I could get into more detail, but I think that's a good overview of what this part of the code is doing. And all in all, the final JavaScript file structure should look something like this. All of this code can also be found on my GitHub if you wish to reference it. The final product looks something like this when everything is untoggled. And like this when the items of interest are toggled. I feel like this was less of a tutorial and more of a project work through, and to be honest, as I've been thinking about what sorts of videos I want to make, I'm thinking of transitioning to more of that than tutorials, simply because while I do like explaining things, I'm realizing that I never know what to explain as well as to what scale I should explain it. And more than anything, what I found that I like to do the most is just simply making things. I love working on little projects more than anything, so maybe I'll lean towards more project work through sorts of videos from here on, taking away from more of the technical aspects, unless asked for otherwise. Anyway, that's all. Thank you. Bye bye now. Push.